December 12, 1944. The mess hall at Camp Shanks, New York, smelled of steam, disinfectant, and something sweet that Ingrid Schaefer could not identify. She stood in line with 47 other German women, all of them wearing the same expression of exhausted weariness. They had been prisoners for 3 weeks now, captured during the chaotic German retreat through the Ardennes forest, transported across the Atlantic in the cold belly of a military ship, and deposited in this strange American facility that looked nothing like the brutal prison camps they had been warned about in their training. The line shuffled forward. Ingrid clutched her metal tray with both hands, feeling the unfamiliar lightness of it. In Germany, even the trays had become scarce, replaced by whatever could be scrounged or salvaged. Here, everything seemed impossibly abundant. The walls were painted, the floors were clean, the lights actually worked. It made her deeply suspicious. Anneliese Weber stood behind her, close enough that Ingrid could hear the younger woman's shallow breathing. Anneliese had barely spoken since their capture, her 22-year-old face frozen in an expression of perpetual shock. She had been a radio operator, spending her war in small rooms filled with equipment, translating signals into meaning. Now she seemed unable to translate anything about this bewildering American reality. The woman serving food wore a clean white apron over her U.S. Army uniform. She was short, round-faced, with dark hair pinned back under a regulation cap. When she looked up at Ingrid, her expression was neither cruel nor kind, simply professional. She said something in English that Ingrid did not understand, then placed something on Ingrid's tray. Ingrid stared down at her plate. A thick slab of pink meat, glistening with some kind of glaze, topped with 2 perfect yellow rings. The rings had holes in their centers, and they sat on the meat like decorative wheels on a child's toy. The yellow was so bright it seemed almost artificial, too vivid to be real food. Juice from the rings had soaked into the meat beneath, creating a shimmering pool of golden liquid that caught the fluorescent lights overhead. Fruit. On meat. Cooked together, served together, as if this were normal. Behind her, Anneliese made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Ingrid glanced back and saw the same bewildered horror on the faces of the other women in line. Hildigard Braun, the oldest among them at 31, had actually stopped moving entirely, staring at her own plate with an expression that suggested she suspected poison. The serving woman gestured for them to keep moving. Her tone was not unkind, but it was firm. Ingrid forced her feet to move, carrying her incomprehensible meal toward the long tables where other German women sat in clusters, speaking in hushed voices. Ingrid sat down carefully, placing her tray on the table as if it might explode. She had been trained as a nurse, had seen wounds that would haunt her forever, had learned to face blood and suffering with steady hands. But this bright yellow fruit sitting atop pink meat defeated every bit of her professional composure. Around her, other women poked at the yellow rings with their forks, testing their solidity. Others simply stared. No one was eating. Ingrid remembered the last real meal she had eaten in Germany. It was March 1943, nearly 2 years ago now, before the rationing had become truly desperate. Her mother had somehow acquired a small chicken, though Ingrid never asked how or what it had cost. They had shared it between 5 people, her parents, her 2 younger brothers, and herself. Each person received perhaps 3 bites of meat. Her mother had made a thin soup from the bones that lasted 2 more days. They had felt fortunate. By 1944, even that modest plenty seemed like a distant dream. Bread became darker, heavier, stretched with sawdust and potato flour. Butter disappeared entirely, replaced by a gray substitute that tasted of chemicals and desperation. Meat existed only in memory and propaganda posters. Her younger brother Klaus, 14 years old, had stopped growing. The doctor said it was temporary, that he would recover once the war ended and food returned. But Ingrid had seen the doubt in the doctor's eyes. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps partly from patriotism, but also because military service meant regular rations. As a nurse attached to a Wehrmacht communications unit, she received slightly more food than civilians. Not much more, but enough to matter. enough to keep her standing during 12-hour shifts, enough to let her send part of her ration home to Klaus. The other women at her table had similar stories. Anneliese spoke softly about her grandmother in Hamburg, who had died the previous winter. Not from bombs, though the city had been devastated by Allied raids. She had simply stopped eating, insisting the younger ones needed the food more. By the time anyone realized what she was doing, she was too weak to recover. Hildigard, normally so controlled and military in her bearing, mentioned almost casually that her daughter, now 7 years old, had never tasted chocolate, had never seen a banana, had no memory of meals that included both meat and vegetables at the same time. Food had become more than sustenance in Germany. It had become the measure of everything: social status, political connections, moral compromises. Those who ate well were either very powerful or very corrupt, often both. Those who ate poorly were everyone else. The gap between the two had grown so wide that they seemed to inhabit different countries entirely. Ingrid had learned to ignore hunger the way soldiers learn to ignore fear. It was always there, a constant background noise in her body and mind, but she had trained herself not to acknowledge it. She ate what was provided, never complained, never asked for more. Complaining accomplished nothing except making others uncomfortable. Asking for more was pointless when there was no more to give. Now she sat in an American prison camp, staring at more food on one plate than she had seen in a single meal for 2 years, and it was decorated, garnished, arranged as if presentation mattered, as if making food beautiful was worth the effort. The extravagance of it felt obscene. She did not know whether to eat it or weep. They had been captured on November 23, 1944, during what the Germans were calling a strategic withdrawal and what everyone else recognized as a desperate retreat. Ingrid's medical unit had been stationed in a converted farmhouse outside a small French village whose name she never learned. The front lines had collapsed faster than anyone anticipated. One morning, they were treating wounded soldiers in relative calm. By afternoon, American tanks were rolling down the road. The commanding officer, a tired captain with a facial tic that had grown worse each day, had given them a choice: destroy the medical supplies and flee east, or stay with the wounded and surrender. Ingrid had chosen to stay. So had most of the other nurses. They had taken an oath, after all. The wounded men in their care could not be moved. Abandoning them felt like a betrayal worse than capture. The Americans had been surprisingly correct. They separated the medical personnel from combat soldiers, documented everyone carefully, and transported them to a collection point in Belgium. Ingrid spent 3 days in a muddy field, sleeping in a tent with 20 other women, before being loaded onto trucks headed for the coast. That was where she met Anneliese and Hildigard. Anneliese had been captured at a communications station near Luxembourg. She was so young, with soft blonde hair and pale blue eyes that made her look even younger than 22. She had been trained to intercept and decode Allied radio transmissions, though she confessed to Ingrid during a whispered conversation on the transport ship that she had never been very good at it. Her real talent was for languages. She spoke French and English, in addition to German, could read Russian, and had been studying Italian before the war interrupted her university education. Hildigard was different entirely. Older, harder, with short dark hair, and a face that seemed carved from stone. She had been a logistics officer, responsible for coordinating supply movements for an entire division. When the Americans captured her convoy outside Nancy, she had been traveling with 3 trucks full of documents she was supposed to have burned. She never explained why she had not destroyed them. Ingrid suspected Hildigard had already known the war was lost and saw no point in making the reconstruction harder than it needed to be. The 3 of them had formed an unlikely alliance during the Atlantic crossing. The ship had been crowded, cold, and miserable. Many of the women became seasick. Others fell into deep depressions, convinced they were being taken to America to be executed or enslaved. Ingrid, Anneliese, and Hildigard had stuck together, sharing blankets, taking turns staying awake to watch their few possessions, helping each other through the worst moments of fear and uncertainty. Now they sat together in this bewildering American mess hall, staring at food that made no sense, trying to understand what kind of country would serve fruit on meat to prisoners of war. Hildigard spoke first, her voice low and controlled. "This is a test," she said. "They are seeing how we react." The barracks assigned to the German women were not what any of them had expected. Ingrid had prepared herself for concrete floors, barbed wire, guards with rifles pointed inward. She had heard stories about Soviet prison camps, about how prisoners froze in winter and starved year-round. She assumed American camps would be different in degree, but not in kind. She was wrong. The building was wooden but solid, with a pitched roof and windows that actually had glass in them. Inside, rows of metal bunk beds lined both walls, each bed made up with 2 wool blankets, a pillow, and sheets that appeared to be clean. A pot-bellied stove sat in the center of the room, radiating warmth. The floor was swept. There were electric lights overhead. At the far end, a door led to a washroom with running water and real toilets. Anneliese had touched one of the blankets with tentative fingers, as if expecting it to vanish like a mirage. "This is better than my apartment in Hamburg," she whispered. Ingrid could not argue. The blanket was thick, properly woven, without holes or patches. In Germany, blankets like this had been requisitioned by the military years ago. Civilians made do with whatever they could find. The American officer who escorted them to the barracks was a woman, which itself was startling. Captain Ruth Henderson was perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair pinned in a neat roll and a face that suggested competence rather than cruelty. She spoke slowly in English, then waited while a translator, a German-speaking private from Milwaukee, converted her words into something the prisoners could understand. "You will be given clean clothes tomorrow," the translator said. "You will receive 3 meals each day. You will be assigned work duties, but nothing beyond your physical capabilities. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. You are prisoners, but you are also human beings, and you will be treated as such." Hildigard had laughed at that, a short bitter sound. "Propaganda," she muttered to Ingrid. "They say these things now. Wait until the cameras leave." But as the days passed, the promised treatment continued. Meals arrived 3 times daily, each more substantial than the last. Clean clothes were distributed, worn but serviceable. A camp doctor, an older man with kind eyes, examined each woman and prescribed medicine for those who needed it. The disconnect between expectation and reality left the German women in a state of confused suspension. They had been trained to hate Americans, taught that they were a mongrel people without culture or discipline. They had been warned that capture meant degradation, abuse, possibly death. Instead, they found themselves in heated buildings, eating regular meals, treated with a distant but genuine courtesy that felt more disorienting than outright cruelty would have been. Ingrid lay in her bunk that first night, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to reconcile everything she had been told with everything she was experiencing. Nothing made sense, especially not the fruit on the meat. The second time they served the mysterious dish, Ingrid decided she needed answers. 3 days had passed since their arrival, and while most of the women had tentatively begun eating the strange fruit-topped meat, none of them understood it. They ate because they were hungry, because refusing food felt foolish when food was offered, but the confusion remained. Ingrid approached the serving line during the lunch meal. The same round-faced woman stood behind the counter, spooning portions onto trays with efficient movements. Ingrid had learned her name was Sergeant Dorothy Martinez. She was from somewhere called New Mexico, which Ingrid understood was a state in the American Southwest, though she could not imagine what kind of place had New and Mexico in the same name. Ingrid had been practicing English phrases with Anneliese, who had the best language skills among them. She knew how to say please and thank you, how to ask for water or permission to use the washroom, but she did not know how to ask about fruit on meat. She pointed at her plate when Sergeant Martinez served her, then pointed at the yellow rings, then made a questioning gesture with her hands. Sergeant Martinez looked at her for a moment, then smiled. It was the first genuine smile Ingrid had seen from any American staff member. Not cruel, not mocking, just amused and perhaps a little sympathetic. She said something in English, speaking slowly, gesturing at the yellow rings. Ingrid caught only one word that meant anything to her. The sergeant repeated it several times, pointing, "Pineapple, pineapple." Ingrid tried the word herself, her German accent making it sound strange and angular. Fell. Sergeant Martinez nodded encouragingly, then made eating gestures, patted her stomach, smiled again. Apparently this pineapple thing was supposed to be good, desirable, something people chose to eat rather than being forced to consume. After the meal, Annalise looked up the word in a small English-German dictionary she had found in the barracks library. Pineapple translated to ananas, which meant nothing to Ingrid. She had never heard of such a fruit. Annalise explained that it grew in tropical places, in hot climates, on plants that looked somewhat like large bushes. It was sweet, she said, reading from the dictionary's brief description. A luxury item, expensive even in peacetime. They put expensive tropical fruit on meat, Hildigard said flatly, listening to this explanation, and serve it to prisoners. She shook her head slowly, her expression caught between disbelief and something that might have been grudging respect. What kind of country has so much that they can waste it on us? That question hung in the air between them. In Germany, pineapple would have been something only the highest Nazi officials could obtain if they could get it at all. Here, it was served to enemy prisoners on a random Thursday afternoon as if it were nothing special. As if abundance were so normal that combining expensive ingredients in strange ways was just another meal. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly, through the simple rhythm of shared meals. 3 times each day, the German women lined up in the mess hall, received their portions, and sat at long tables that gradually became less segregated. At first, they had clustered together defensively, speaking only German, avoiding eye contact with the American staff. But proximity and routine have a way of breaking down barriers that ideology cannot maintain. It started with small practical necessities. Annalise needed to ask for salt and did not know the English word. An American guard, Private Mary O'Sullivan, a red-haired girl from Boston who looked barely 18, had shown her the salt shaker and said the word clearly, salt. Simple enough. Annalise repeated it, received a smile, and the interaction ended. But the next day, Annalise said, "Salt please," without prompting, and Private O'Sullivan had looked genuinely pleased. Sergeant Martinez began teaching food vocabulary during serving times. She would point at items and name them clearly, waiting for the German women to repeat. Potatoes, carrots, bread, coffee. The women started responding, at first mechanically, then with growing interest. Learning the names of food felt safer than learning other words. Food was neutral territory, free from politics or accusations. Ingrid found herself looking forward to these brief exchanges. Sergeant Martinez had a patient way of teaching, never showing frustration when someone mispronounced a word, always willing to repeat herself. One afternoon, Ingrid gathered her courage and asked, in halting English, "Why pineapple on ham?" She had learned that the pink meat was called ham, another new word in her expanding vocabulary. Sergeant Martinez had smiled that warm smile again and launched into an explanation that Ingrid only partially understood. Something about sweetness balancing saltiness, about cooking techniques that made flavors work together. She mentioned a place called Hawaii, which Annalise later explained was a group of islands in the Pacific Ocean where pineapples grew abundantly. The way Sergeant Martinez described it, putting pineapple on ham, was not strange at all. It was traditional, popular, something American families had been doing for years. This revelation unsettled Ingrid more than the dish itself had. The Americans were not trying to mock or confuse them. They were simply serving normal American food, the kind of thing they would serve to their own families. The strangeness was not intentional cruelty. It was just difference, just the gap between two cultures that had been taught to see each other as enemies rather than as people who ate different foods and lived different lives. Hildigard began sitting closer to the serving line, watching Sergeant Martinez work. She had been a logistics officer, responsible for food distribution among thousands of soldiers. She understood the complexity of feeding large groups, the planning and organization required. One day she said, in careful English, "You work very hard." Sergeant Martinez had looked surprised, then touched, then replied with something kind that made Hildigard almost smile. The mail arrived on a cold January morning, brought by a Red Cross representative who distributed envelopes to 32 of the 48 women in the camp. Ingrid received 2 letters, both postmarked from Munich over a month earlier. Her hands trembled as she opened the first one, recognizing her mother's handwriting, the careful script, shaky in a way it had never been before. The letter was brief, constrained by censorship rules, and perhaps by things too painful to write. Her mother spoke of weather, of neighbors who had moved away, of her father's work at the factory. Between the careful lines, Ingrid read everything her mother could not say directly. The factory had been bombed again. Neighbors had not moved away. They had been killed or fled. And then, near the end, a single sentence that made Ingrid's throat tighten. Klaus is very thin now, but he says he is managing well enough. Very thin. Managing well enough. The careful euphemisms of someone who knew their mail would be read by authorities, who understood that complaining accomplished nothing, who was trying to protect her daughter from worry while simultaneously begging her to understand how bad things had become. The second letter was from her aunt in Berlin, even shorter, even more constrained. She mentioned standing in line for 6 hours to receive a ration of bread that was mostly sawdust. She mentioned that the apartment building next to hers no longer existed. She mentioned, almost casually, that she had traded her wedding ring for 3 potatoes and considered it a fair bargain. Around the mess hall that evening, other women shared similar news. Anneliese had received word that her family's apartment in Hamburg had been completely destroyed in a firebombing raid. They were living with relatives now, 12 people in 3 rooms, sharing 1 meal a day. Hildigard's letter from her sister described children in Berlin eating wallpaper paste because it contained traces of flour. The elderly were dying quietly in their beds, not from bombs but from simple starvation and cold. The contrast between these letters and their current reality created a guilt so profound it felt like physical illness. Ingrid looked down at her dinner plate that evening, at the generous portion of ham with pineapple, at the heap of mashed potatoes, at the thick slice of bread with real butter, and felt something break inside her chest. Her brother was starving. Her mother was trading family heirlooms for food, and she, a prisoner of war, was eating better than she had eaten in 3 years. She forced herself to take a bite, knowing that refusing food would not feed Klaus, would not help her mother, would accomplish nothing except making her weaker. But the pineapple tasted like guilt now, sweet and terrible in her mouth. Across the table, Anneliese was crying quietly, still holding her letter, trying to eat through tears. Sergeant Martinez noticed. She did not say anything, but she brought them both extra portions of bread, wrapped carefully in napkins, gesturing that they could save it for later. Captain Henderson announced the plan during the morning assembly in late November. The American staff would celebrate their Thanksgiving holiday, and the German women were invited to help prepare the feast. The invitation was not mandatory, she emphasized through the translator, but those who wished to participate would learn about American traditions and gain useful kitchen skills. Ingrid volunteered immediately, driven partly by curiosity and partly by a desperate need for distraction from the guilt that had consumed her since receiving her mother's letter. Anneliese and Hildigard joined her, along with 15 other women. They reported to the kitchen at dawn on Thanksgiving morning, where Sergeant Martinez greeted them with aprons and a list of tasks that seemed impossibly ambitious. The centerpiece of the meal would be turkey, a bird Ingrid had only seen in pictures. Sergeant Martinez showed them 3 enormous turkeys, each weighing perhaps 15 pounds, explaining through gestures and simple English words how they would be prepared. She demonstrated the seasoning process, the basting technique, the careful attention required to ensure the meat cooked evenly. Ingrid watched, fascinated by the precision and care devoted to a single meal. But it was the other dishes that truly amazed them. Sweet potatoes topped with something called marshmallows, which Anneliese identified as a kind of candy. Cranberry sauce, made from fresh berries cooked with sugar. Stuffing prepared with bread, herbs, and butter. Green bean casserole topped with crispy fried onions. Pumpkin pie for dessert, made from a vegetable. Ingrid had only known as animal feed. Hildigard, assigned to peel potatoes, worked in silence for an hour before finally speaking. "In Germany," she said quietly, "we could feed a village for a week with the food being prepared for one meal." Sergeant Martinez, overhearing through the translator, paused in her work. Her expression grew serious. "My grandmother fled Mexico during the revolution," she said slowly, waiting for the translation. "She told me stories about hunger, about watching people die for lack of food. She came to America with nothing." She gestured around the abundant kitchen. "This plenty, it is not something to feel guilty about. It is something to be grateful for, and maybe something to share." The words hung in the air between them, complicated and uncomfortable, and somehow important. Ingrid understood that Sergeant Martinez was not trying to dismiss their guilt or make light of Germany's suffering. She was offering a different way of thinking about abundance, suggesting that plenty could be a responsibility rather than just a privilege. The Thanksgiving meal that afternoon included all the American staff and all the German prisoners, seated together at long tables arranged in a rough rectangle. Captain Henderson said a prayer of thanks, translated sentence by sentence, thanking God for peace that would eventually come, for the possibility of understanding between former enemies, for the simple blessing of enough food to share. Ingrid ate her turkey and sweet potatoes, tasting not just the food but the strange possibility that maybe, somehow, there could be enough for everyone. Hildigard Braun had been the most resistant among them from the beginning. At 31, she was older than most of the prisoners, harder in ways that came from years of military discipline and personal loss. She had been married once, briefly, to a Luftwaffe pilot who died over Britain in 1940. She never spoke of him, but Ingrid had seen the faded photograph she kept folded in her pocket, creased from constant handling. In the weeks since their arrival, Hildigard had maintained a careful emotional distance from the Americans. She ate their food because refusing would be foolish. She followed their rules because disobeying would be pointless, but she never smiled at their attempts at friendliness, never volunteered for additional duties, never showed any sign that she saw them as anything other than the enemy who happened to be winning. But something shifted during the kitchen work. Sergeant Martinez had a way of commanding a workspace that reminded Hildigard of her own logistics experience. Nothing was wasted. Every movement had purpose. Tasks were distributed according to ability rather than rank. Hildigard found herself drawn into conversations about efficiency, about managing limited resources, about the mathematics of feeding large groups. One afternoon, while preparing the evening meal, Sergeant Martinez asked Hildigard about her work before capture. Through the translator and supplemented by Hildigard's improving English, she explained her role coordinating supply movements. Sergeant Martinez listened with genuine interest, asking questions about logistics under wartime conditions, about how Hildigard had managed when resources became scarce. "My family came from Chihuahua during the revolution," Sergeant Martinez said, speaking slowly enough for Hildigard to follow. "My father told me stories about the supply lines, how armies moved, how people survived when everything was chaos. He said the logistics officers were the real generals, because without them, nothing else mattered." Hildigard felt something unexpected in her chest, a recognition of being seen and understood. In Germany, logistics work was considered unglamorous, administrative rather than heroic. The glory went to pilots and tank commanders, not to the officers who ensured those pilots had fuel and those tanks had ammunition. But Sergeant Martinez spoke of it with respect, as if managing supplies was a skill worth acknowledging. "Your family," Hildigard asked carefully, "they also suffered under dictatorship?" Sergeant Martinez nodded, her expression growing distant. "My grandfather was killed by government soldiers. My grandmother walked 300 miles to the border with 5 children, including my father who was 8 years old. She had nothing but what they could carry." Hildigard thought about this, about dictators and suffering that extended beyond Germany's borders, about other countries that had experienced versions of what her homeland was enduring now. She had been taught that Germany's pain was unique, that their struggle justified everything. But here was this woman whose family had fled their own kind of darkness, who had every reason to hate all Germans, and she was teaching Hildigard how to make pumpkin pie. The idea began with Anneliese, who had always been the most nostalgic among them. One evening in late December, she sat on her bunk, writing in a small notebook, her face concentrated in the dim light. Ingrid asked what she was doing, and Anneliese looked up with something almost like embarrassment. "I am trying to remember my grandmother's recipe for Lebkuchen," she said quietly. "The Christmas cookies she made every year. I am afraid I will forget the exact proportions, the way she mixed the spices." Her voice caught slightly. "I am afraid I will forget everything about home." The comment resonated through the barracks. Other women began pulling out scraps of paper, pencil stubs, the margins of letters. They started writing down recipes from memory, dishes their mothers and grandmothers had prepared, meals that represented home in ways that transcended simple nutrition. Sauerbraten, Kartoffelsalat, Spätzle, Apfelstrudel. The names themselves were a kind of prayer, an incantation against forgetting. Hildigard, surprisingly, contributed the most elaborate recipes. She had apparently learned to cook from her mother, who had run a small restaurant in Berlin before the war. She could describe, in precise detail, the exact technique for making proper Rindsrouladen, the timing required for perfect Schweinebraten, the delicate balance of sweet and sour in traditional red cabbage. But something interesting happened as the recipe collection grew. The women began adding American dishes they had learned in the camp kitchen. Sergeant Martinez's method for roasting turkey, the technique for making cranberry sauce, the proper ratio of marshmallow to sweet potato. These foreign recipes appeared on the same pages as their traditional German dishes, creating an accidental fusion that none of them had planned. Ingrid found herself writing down the ham with pineapple recipe, carefully noting the brown sugar glaze, the arrangement of the pineapple rings, the oven temperature and timing. She wrote in German, but the dish was purely American, and seeing it recorded in her own handwriting felt like crossing some invisible boundary. Captain Henderson learned about the project and surprised them by providing a proper blank book, bound with cardboard covers and lined pages. She suggested they create an official cookbook, something that could be shared and preserved. The women took turns carefully transcribing their recipes into this new book, adding notes and variations, sometimes including small sketches to illustrate technique. The project became a bridge between their past and their uncertain future. Each recipe was a story, a connection to people and places that might no longer exist. But they were also instructions, practical knowledge that could be carried forward, used to recreate fragments of home wherever they eventually ended up. Anneliese wrote her grandmother's Lebkuchen recipe on one page. On the facing page, she wrote Sergeant Martinez's pumpkin pie recipe. She looked at the two entries together, then smiled slightly, sadly. "Maybe someday," she said to Ingrid, "I will make both. Maybe they can exist in the same kitchen without contradicting each other." Ingrid thought that was the most hopeful thing she had heard in months. Christmas, 1944, arrived with unexpected snow and an ache of homesickness so profound it felt like illness. The German women woke on Christmas Eve to find the camp transformed into something from a postcard, everything covered in white, icicles hanging from the barracks roof like crystal decorations. It was beautiful and terrible, reminding them of Christmases in Germany, of families they could not reach, of traditions interrupted by war. Captain Henderson had arranged for a small Christmas tree to be placed in the common room, and she invited the women to decorate it however they wished. They created ornaments from whatever materials they could find, folding paper into stars, stringing popcorn into garlands, cutting snowflakes from old newspapers. The tree grew slowly more decorated over several days, becoming a collaborative project that occupied restless hands and distracted anxious minds. Hildigard contributed ornaments made from twisted wire, surprisingly delicate despite her practical nature. Anneliese folded elaborate paper angels, using a technique her grandmother had taught her. Ingrid helped string the popcorn, a distinctly American tradition that felt foreign but not unwelcome. They worked alongside American staff. Private O'Sullivan demonstrating how to make paper chains, Sergeant Martinez showing them how to thread cranberries onto string. On Christmas Eve, Captain Henderson made an unexpected announcement. The German women would be permitted to hold a brief religious service in their own language, and any American staff who wished to attend would be welcome. A chaplain from a nearby Lutheran church had volunteered to lead the service, a man whose grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria and who still spoke German fluently. That evening, 48 German women and 17 American staff members crowded into the common room. The chaplain, an elderly man with kind eyes and a thick accent, led them through familiar hymns. They sang Stille Nacht first, the melody rising through the room with an intensity born of longing and loss. Ingrid felt tears on her face and made no effort to hide them. Then something remarkable happened. Private O'Sullivan, in a clear soprano voice, began singing Silent Night in English, harmonizing with the German version. Other American voices joined her, creating a strange bilingual chorus that should not have worked but somehow did. Two languages, two former enemies, singing the same prayer for peace in different words that meant the same thing. After the service, Sergeant Martinez brought out cookies. She had spent the previous day baking, and she presented 2 plates, one with American sugar cookies decorated with colored icing, the other with German Pfeffernuss she had made using Hildigard's recipe from the cookbook project. The cookies sat side by side, neither more important than the other, both offered freely. Hildigard took a Pfeffernuss and bit into it carefully, her eyes closed for a moment. "This tastes like my mother's kitchen," she said quietly. Then she took an American sugar cookie and smiled, a real smile that transformed her usually stern face. "But this is good too." It was the first time Ingrid had heard her admit that anything American could be good. The news arrived in January 1945, filtering through official channels and unofficial whispers, creating a growing sense of horror that no one wanted to believe. Allied forces advancing through Poland had liberated a place called Auschwitz. The reports described things that seemed impossible, atrocities on a scale that defied comprehension. Camps designed not for prisoners of war, but for systematic extermination. Gas chambers disguised as showers. Crematoriums running day and night. Mountains of shoes, of eyeglasses, of human hair. Captain Henderson called an assembly. Her face was grave as she explained, through the translator, that the German women needed to hear what was being discovered. Not as punishment, she emphasized, but because they had a right to know what their country had done in their name. She read from official reports, describing Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. The numbers were incomprehensible. Hundreds of thousands, millions, Jews, Roma, political prisoners, anyone deemed undesirable by the Reich. The German women sat in stunned silence. Some shook their heads in denial. Others wept. Hildigard's face turned gray, her hands clenched into fists. Anneliese looked physically ill, pressing one hand to her mouth as if fighting nausea. Ingrid felt the room spinning, felt everything she thought she knew about her country crumbling into dust. "This is propaganda," one woman shouted from the back, her voice shrill with desperation. Allied lies to justify their treatment of Germany. But her words sounded hollow even to herself. Captain Henderson produced photographs, though she warned they were disturbing. She passed them around slowly, giving each woman the choice to look or not look. Ingrid looked. She forced herself to look because she was a nurse, because she had seen terrible things, because she believed she owed the dead that much. The photographs showed skeletal figures in striped uniforms, piles of corpses, children with hollow eyes. These were not propaganda creations. These were real people who had suffered and died, while Ingrid wore her gray auxiliary uniform and believed she was serving her country's defense. That night, the barracks was silent, except for quiet weeping. No one spoke. What was there to say? How could anyone defend or explain what they had just learned? Ingrid lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, thinking about every moment she had been proud to serve Germany, every time she had believed the propaganda about defending the homeland, about fighting for civilization against barbarism. Sergeant Martinez found her in the washroom an hour later, splashing cold water on her face. The sergeant did not say anything at first, just stood nearby, present, but not intrusive. Finally, Ingrid spoke, her English halting and broken. "I did not know. We did not know. But not knowing, it does not matter, does it? We still served them. We still helped." Sergeant Martinez was quiet for a long moment. "What matters now," she finally said, "is what you choose to do with this knowledge. You cannot change the past, but you can decide who you become next." May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. In Camp Shanks, the announcement was met with mixed reactions from the American staff, jubilation tempered by exhaustion and the knowledge that the Pacific War continued. For the German women, the news brought a complicated mixture of relief, grief, and uncertainty about what came next. Captain Henderson called another assembly 3 days later. The Red Cross had arranged for repatriation of all German prisoners of war. Ships would begin departing in June, transporting them back to Germany. The process would be orderly, voluntary, and conducted according to international agreements. Any woman who wished to return home would be assisted in doing so. But then, Captain Henderson said something unexpected. The United States government, in consultation with military authorities and humanitarian organizations, was offering certain prisoners the opportunity to remain in America. Those who could demonstrate valuable skills, who had cooperated fully during their internment, who had no connection to war crimes, could apply for provisional status that might eventually lead to permanent residency. It was unprecedented, controversial, and offered to very few. The German women had 2 weeks to decide. Return to a defeated, devastated homeland, or stay in the country that had been their enemy, starting completely over in a foreign land, with a foreign language, and no guarantee of anything except the possibility of a different future. The barracks erupted into fierce debate. Some women were adamant about returning. Germany was their home. Their families were there, whatever the cost they needed to go back and help rebuild. Others were equally certain they wanted to stay. What was there to return to? Ruined cities, starvation, shame. At least in America there was food, work, the chance to escape the shadow of what Germany had become. Ingrid sat with her 2 closest companions, trying to think through the impossible choice. Annalise spoke first, her voice quiet but firm. "My family is alive. They survived the bombing. They wrote to me last week. How can I not go back to them?" Ingrid understood. Family was everything. Blood was thicker than any political consideration. Hildigard surprised them both. "I am staying," she said flatly. "My daughter is with her grandmother in Bavaria. She is safe, fed, cared for. If I return now, I am just another mouth to feed, another burden. But if I stay here, work, save money, maybe I can send help, maybe I can bring them here eventually." She paused, her voice dropping. "And maybe I cannot face going back to a country that did those things, that allowed those things to happen while we convinced ourselves we were the civilized ones." Ingrid thought about her mother's letters, about Klaus who was so thin, about her father working in a bombed factory. She thought about ham with pineapple, about abundance that seemed impossible, about Sergeant Martinez's grandmother who walked 300 miles for freedom. She thought about choosing who to become instead of accepting who she had been. Ingrid wrote 3 letters. The first was to her mother, the hardest one, explaining that she would not be returning on the repatriation ships. She tried to find words that would not sound like abandonment, that would help her mother understand this was not about rejecting family, but about finding a way to help them better. She promised to send money as soon as she was able to work. She promised to bring them to America eventually, though she had no idea if such a thing was possible. She promised she still loved them. That distance did not diminish obligation. The letter took her 4 hours to write, and she cried through most of it. The second letter was to the Red Cross, formally requesting permission to remain in the United States under the provisional program. She listed her nursing qualifications, her language skills, which had improved dramatically over 6 months, her clean conduct record during internment. She provided references from Captain Henderson and Sergeant Martinez, both of whom had agreed to support her application. She explained that she wished to work in healthcare, to contribute to American society, to earn the privilege of eventual citizenship through honest labor and dedication. The third letter was to herself, written in the same small diary she had kept throughout her captivity. She wrote about the girl who had arrived at Camp Shanks 6 months ago, who had believed in her country despite everything, who had never tasted pineapple, who had thought Americans were the enemy. She wrote about watching that girl slowly dissolve, her certainties crumbling under the weight of truth and unexpected kindness. She wrote about the woman she was becoming, someone who understood that nationality was an accident of birth, but character was a choice. When she told Annalise her decision, her friend cried, but did not try to change her mind. "I understand," Annalise said, hugging her tightly. "You must do what is right for you. And maybe this way you can help your family more than if you returned hungry and hopeless." They promised to write, to maintain their connection, across whatever distances lay ahead. Hildigard simply nodded when Ingrid told her, a gesture of solidarity between two women who had chosen the same difficult path. "We will help each other," Hildigard said. "Neither of us knows what comes next, but at least we do not face it alone." The approval came 3 weeks later. Ingrid and Hildigard, along with 9 other women from their group, were granted provisional status. They would be released from the camp into supervised work programs, placed with families or institutions that had agreed to sponsor them. Ingrid was assigned to a hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, where her nursing skills were desperately needed. She would live in nurses' housing, receive a small salary, and work under the supervision of the hospital administration. The night before her departure from Camp Shanks, Sergeant Martinez prepared a special dinner. Ham with pineapple, the dish that had seemed so impossible 6 months ago, now familiar and almost comforting. Ingrid ate slowly, tasting not just food but transformation. The farewell dinner took place on a warm June evening, the last time all 48 women would be together in one place. Those returning to Germany would leave the following morning. Those staying would depart for their various placements over the next few days. Captain Henderson had arranged for the mess hall to be decorated with flowers from the camp garden, and Sergeant Martinez had prepared the most elaborate meal any of them had experienced during their entire internment. The tables were arranged in a large square so everyone could see each other. American staff sat interspersed with German prisoners, the distinctions between captor and captive having blurred over months of daily interaction into something more like colleagues, perhaps even friends. The meal began with a soup that combined both German and American techniques, a recipe Sergeant Martinez and Hildigard had developed together. Then came the main course. Ham with pineapple, prepared exactly the way it had been that first bewildering day in December. But this time, when the plates were served, the German women smiled instead of staring in confusion. This time they knew what pineapple was, understood why fruit and meat could work together, recognized the dish as a symbol of everything they had learned about abundance and generosity and the possibility of understanding between different peoples. Captain Henderson stood to make a speech. She spoke slowly, pausing for translation. Though most of the German women could now understand enough English to follow along, she talked about the 6 months they had spent together, about the journey from mutual suspicion to something approaching respect. She acknowledged the difficulty of the choices each woman had made, whether to return home or stay in a foreign land. She emphasized that both choices were valid, honorable, based on individual circumstances that no one else could judge. "You came here as enemies," she said, her voice carrying through the quiet room. "You leave as women who have shown courage, dignity, and the capacity for growth that gives me hope for the future. Whether you return to Germany or remain in America, you take with you the knowledge that people can change, that understanding is possible even after terrible conflict." Then Ingrid stood, surprising herself with her own boldness. Her English was accented but clear, improved by months of practice. "We came here expecting cruelty," she said. "We found kindness instead. We came believing we understood the world. We learned we understood nothing. We leave knowing that home is not just a place, but a choice we make about who we wish to become." The meal continued with dessert, both American apple pie and German Apfelstrudel, sitting side by side on the serving table. Women moved between tables, exchanging final addresses, making promises to write, crying and laughing in equal measure. Sergeant Martinez gave Hildigard and Ingrid copies of the cookbook they had created together, bound properly now, a record of recipes and memories. As the evening ended, the women who were staying watched their friends board the buses that would take them to the port, beginning their journey back across the Atlantic. 25 years later, on a spring afternoon in 1970, Ingrid Schaefer stood in the kitchen of her restaurant in Worcester, Massachusetts. The establishment was small but successful, known for its unusual fusion of German and American cuisines. The specialty of the house, featured prominently on the menu, was ham with pineapple, prepared exactly the way Sergeant Martinez had taught her a quarter-century ago. Ingrid was 51 now, an American citizen for 18 years, her accent still present but softened by time and practice. She had brought her family to America in 1953, sponsoring her mother and Klaus, who was now a professor of engineering at Boston University. Her father had died in Germany in 1948, but he had known before his death that his family would be safe, would be fed, would have a future. The restaurant was busy most evenings, filled with a mix of customers who came for the food and stayed for the stories. Ingrid had a habit of talking to diners, explaining the origins of her recipes, the journey that brought her from Munich to Massachusetts. She never hid her history. Former German prisoner of war, she would say matter-of-factly, as if it were simply one biographical detail among many. That evening, a young couple asked about the ham with pineapple, curious about why a German restaurant served such a distinctly American dish. Ingrid sat down at their table, something she did when time permitted, and told them the story. She described arriving at Camp Shanks in December 1944, the bewilderment of seeing fruit on meat for the first time, the gradual transformation from prisoner to immigrant to citizen. "That dish taught me that the world was bigger than I understood," she said, "that what seems wrong might just be different, that abundance shared is better than scarcity hoarded, that people who seem like enemies might simply be people who eat different foods and speak different languages, but want the same things in the end." The couple listened, fascinated. The young woman asked if Ingrid ever regretted staying instead of returning to Germany. Ingrid considered the question seriously, as she always did. "I regret that I had to make such a choice," she said finally. "I regret the war that created the circumstances, but the choice itself, no. I chose life over loyalty to a country that had betrayed every value worth having. I chose to become someone different than who I was trained to be." She still kept in touch with some of the women from Camp Shanks. Anneliese had returned to Germany, married a teacher, raised 3 children in rebuilt Hamburg. They exchanged letters twice a year. Hildigard had eventually brought her daughter to America and now ran a catering business in Philadelphia. They met several times a year, 2 old friends who understood each other's journey. Above the restaurant's kitchen door, Ingrid had hung a framed photograph from that last dinner at Camp Shanks. 48 German women and their American captors, sharing a meal of ham with pineapple, choosing their futures together.